We're now going to move on to our next panel, which is Platforms as Publishers, Rights and Responsibilities. And so for that, I'm going to welcome on stage my old friend David Clinch. We used to work together at Storyful. And he's going to be joined on stage by Kate Crawford, Andrew McLaughlin, Zaymat Tufekci, and unfortunately, Ethan Zuckerman had to pull out late last night because he has a sick child. So get well soon, Ethan's child. So they're going to do a little bit of jiggery pokery on stage, but I just wanted to say this question of whether platforms are publishers, we've had some pushback about this, which is, no, they're absolutely not publishers, but you can't deny that they're starting to make publishing decisions. Whether it's the first Saturday after Twitter Moments launched was the bombing in Ankara, and Twitter had to make a decision about whether they showed that graphic imagery or not. So the social networks are having to make increasing publishing decisions as they curate. They're not necessarily publishing their own content, but they are making curation decisions. And as Mark suggested, they're not necessarily coming from a journalism background. So this panel is really going to explore some of these tensions that we're starting to see as the social networks are moving into this publishing space. Whether or not we can call them publishers is a different question, and I'm sure David's going to maybe push some of the panelists on that. But I think everybody looks pretty ready, yes? Okay, so David, over to you.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Emily, and everybody for hosting us today. First of all, I wanted to quickly apologize. I'm standing in at the last minute here because my partner in crime, Mark Little, who is here, was meant to be moderating this panel, but he went over to the dark side, or is it the light side, and is joining Twitter, so he recused himself because he's now a platform or a publisher or one of those things. So secondly, we're not going to do introductions, we'll just go quickly into this, but just to sort of outline what we're doing. I don't know about you, but I like to think of this subject that we're talking about, of the news industry, the audience, or what used to be called the audience, and the platforms coming in like this from below as a really hot, dangerous three-way that we're all watching and looking at and involved in. And I've spent the last 5 or 6 years of my career at Storyful living right in this little sweet spot where all three of those meet, right in the middle where publishers, platforms, and the audience all meet right in the middle. And that's a really interesting place to be as a journalist right now. But I also like to think of that three-way, if you want to take my really bad metaphor to its logical conclusion, as something which, you know, our Freudian analysts here are taking one step back from and looking at to try and work out who's screwing who, basically. And we've got three really good, we would have had four if Ethan was here, really good examples of people who think a lot about this. It's a rapidly changing environment. It's really hard to know exactly where the lines are. Even the title of this panel, as Claire explained, is controversial. Our platforms, publishers, and we can get into that in more detail. But again, in lieu of outlining who you are, because that's in the brochure, I'd like all of you, all three, starting with you, to just quickly give us a quick Irish minute on what you think the big issues are here with platforms as publishers.
Okay, I don't know what an Irish minute means, but there seems to be an Anglo invasion, and so I'll just start with the Turkish
colonization
invasion.
of time.
Yeah. The Turkish hordes will join. So basically, we know that more and more people are getting their news through social sources, right? We know that people are getting their news through social media. This is especially pronounced for younger generations. Also, in a lot of places where the media is censored or controlled or pressured, including in Turkey, where I'm originally hailing from, the platforms aren't just for young people who are getting news socially. They have become the main places of dissemination of news. I mean, you can argue, are they publishers, are they platforms, a lot, but if you're in Turkey, Facebook and Twitter are so central to the news ecology because the mainstream media, the actual mass media ecology is close to worthless something, you know, it's very little. So that's the key issue. Now, I know that a lot of people might have read or heard about my writing last year about how on Twitter Ferguson exploded as a topic, while on Facebook it was kind of hard to like. So it hadn't really bubbled up to the surface. So I wrote the sort of piece wondering of a counterfactual world where, you know, there was no Twitter, where something like Ferguson and the protests hadn't bubbled up. There were 3 million or so tweets before mainstream traditional press covered it, and it was fairly missing in Facebook, although of course we don't know the exact numbers, but it seems to have been the case. So you might have read that, so that's a big issue. I want to sort of go really fast forward to what seems like a minor change that a lot of us have been complaining about, even though clicking on that big red heart on Twitter that explodes with bling, it's very cute and nice and everything. So what does that do to Twitter, which is, again, so key in a place like Turkey? The first round of discussions about it from Twitter were about, oh, look, there's more engagement. And that's the problem I see. That word, you know, sort of embodies so much of the contradictions I want to talk about, because engagement by itself is not a core value of journalism, right? Because the engagement with what has to be part of it. As an experiment a couple months ago, I uploaded to Facebook a really horrific, awful video. Refugee kids sort of wading through the water. They survived, but they barely made it, and a young man carrying them to safety, kind of trying to calm them, and their dead bodies around them. It's just horrible. Says, it's okay, kids, we made it. You know, it's okay, baby. So it's very, I just was sort of very upset by the video. I followed Facebook's guidelines. I knew that it was a native video, would get seen more. I downloaded the video, ripped it, uploaded it to Facebook, and posted it. And my Facebook posts do circulate, and you get with videos, you get views. It got almost no engagement, because how can you like it? One friend commented, I don't even know what to say. One friend put 3 dots, and that was it. It didn't get a chance to be engaged. So when Twitter comes back to us and says, oh, look, people are engaging more, I'm like, yes, that's great for you as a company that's selling ads, but what are they engaging more with or less with? Now, probably the hearts aren't a big deal, but it's a really good, I think, moment. I'm not saying hearts are going to kill Twitter as a news ecology, not at all. You know, we'll get used to it. But the Silicon Valley measures and the journalistic measures are not the one and the same. And engagement, which seems like a magic word, does not answer the questions we have. Add on top of it the fact that the algorithms are now optimized for engagement.
We're going to get back to algorithms in a second. So, Kate, just quick Irish minute again. What are the big issues here? Platforms as publishers.
Sure. Well, I guess
concerns. What should we be worried about?
Oh, okay. Well, I just want to start by saying something I'm delighted about, which is the Tau Centre and being here today. I think so many of the fellows here are doing the research that really matters in this space, and I just applaud you all. It's fantastic to see so much critical research about journalism and the press. I guess my sort of short take on this would be that something very radical has happened in the last 5 years. And we've seen the complete erosion, I think, of this idea of there being 3 spaces, of like the audience and the publishers and the platforms. I actually really disagree with that. I think we've seen a radical diffusion of the various particles of how we used to understand the operation of the press. This idea that the press was held in the venerable houses of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, the Guardian, has really changed. We see players like Snapchat, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram playing extraordinarily powerful new roles in the dissemination and understanding of information in the world. So how do we think about this? Well, I think the first thing that's really interesting when we think about this kind of subatomic diffusion that's going on well outside of the traditional boundaries of the press is that there was this thing that we used to understand as journalistic ethics. And it was, I can remember being taught this, back in the day and thinking, these seem pretty sensible principles. But it's interesting to realize that those principles are really very different to a lot of the kind of Silicon Valley companies that are becoming major players in this space. So one of the things that I did working with the amazing Mike Ananny, whose work in this space I think is fantastic, we went and did a big study interviewing the people designing news apps in Silicon Valley, also in New York, in Boston, in Helsinki, and in Cambridge in the UK. So we got this really nice sense of what were the values that people were encoding into these apps. And we started out by asking about, traditional journalistic values. Are you thinking about how the most important stories should propagate the furthest? What are the things you're valuing? And can you guess what it was? By far and away, the biggest value was we just want users. We just want people coming back. We just want to be the most popular app in this space. Now, that's completely understandable. Making an app is a very complicated and expensive process. But it's a really interesting set of values when you start comparing that to the kinds of traditional ideas about responsibility to audience. And one of the things I found fascinating was how many of these designers were saying, look, if somebody just wants to read news stories about marmots or the Kardashians, that's completely fine. Like, we're not going to try and introduce other news stories into that ecology. And I think that's quite a different set of paradigms around news values. Now, I actually think in some ways this is a really exciting moment because that discussion around what constitutes great journalistic practice is now involving a lot more players. So that's I think, the exciting challenge rather than a worrying one, but we need to do a lot of work in that space.
All right, great. Andrew, your top line.
So, so there's been this big sort of like shift taking place that we've all been watching. And broadly, that shift is you've had platforms that are able to get large audiences, but need really great content on those platforms in order to keep those audiences there and engaged. And then you've got people doing creative work, journalists, writers, and so forth, that need audiences for the things that they're writing. And so the standoff has been, well, they both sort of need each other. It's been in the platform's interests not to, in your words, David, screw the publishers, and the publishers' interests, to sort of play along with the platforms. And so we've been watching the power balance shift towards the platforms. And the new thing that I've noticed lately, over the last really just couple of months, that is kind of alarming to me, is I've noticed a deep sense of panic spreading among publishers. The trigger for it in some ways, I think, or at least the conscious surfacing of that emotion was ad blocking. Right, so a lot of the publisher people that are friends of mine and that I've been working with feel like they've been laboring and struggling to try to make digital media work. They've gone through any number of strategies, from acquiring classified listings companies like Axel Springer has done, to investing in mobile app experiences like many American companies have done. They feel like, oh God, like we just have gone through all of this. We sort of thought we could understand some possible ramp up of digital revenues that might pay for this whole thing, and now it's all getting blown apart because people are deploying ad blockers everywhere. And I actually am sanguine about that. I think that the ad blockers are just going to force a better, user experience. But at this moment, panic can make you do good things and rise to the occasion, and panic can also make you do terrible things and make expedient compromises that you will come to rue later. And I fear that that's what's happening right now, where the platforms, I don't think through any ill will, and I'm a platform guy. Like, I worked at Google, I worked at Tumblr. I actually set up a little reporting unit inside Tumblr that was, euthanized later when cash pressure became an issue for the company, and is a cautionary tale if for no other reason than that. But so the platforms are not out there trying to overwhelmingly consume the full corpus of advertising revenue that exists, because they know that they need these publishers, meaning content creators, to use a terrible word, meaning creative workers, to keep writing and researching and reporting and making things worth reading. But nevertheless, their focus on user experience, which is the thing they know as technologists, has said, we have to kill these awful mobile websites that are blowing up people's phones and melting down their browsers as they try to download a single story. So anyway, so what I'm seeing is maybe potentially very short-sighted panic on the part of publishers. And so that gets us to where I think the discussion should go, which is, given this massive shift of power that seems to be taking place over the reading experience and the presentation of distilled feeds of particular stories out of the vast ocean of potential things that people could be reading, what should we be thinking about the platforms and their ethical responsibilities, their business responsibilities, and how these things all feed together?
Brilliant outline of the subject. Let's try and hit some of those subjects in a little bit more depth, but having said depth, we need to keep the answers pretty short so we can go through all of this. One of the founding principles of Storyful when we started was there is no algorithm for journalism, and I firmly believe that. But I've also learned over the last few years, and we're a company that works with both news industry and the platforms, or right in between them, is that in many cases, I completely agree with you, platforms don't have sort of ill will or anything like that, but they're dealing in a world where algorithms are designed to create scale. And journalism is essentially the enemy of scale, because journalism is about saying less, not more, better, not everything. And so what are these algorithms? What do we know about them, and what do we not know about them? And whose responsibility is that? If they do have this power, either deliberately or incidentally, whose responsibility? You wrote about it with Ferguson, and that's a perfect example, I think, and other stories, even the college protests that are happening this week that platforms are involved in. Whose responsibility is the function of those algorithms? And what more do we need to know about them?
So I think this is the word responsibility is great, because the problem isn't the algorithms per se. There is a lot of content, and you do need some ways to sift through them. The problem isn't, as Kate said, the fact that they want to be popular, or the problem isn't engagement. I want to be clear. I'm not saying, oh, let's not seek engagement. It's just that the platforms have been very steadfast in we're just giving people what they want line, and we're just making whatever's popular without acknowledging what you just said, which is that they're designing worlds over which they have great amount of control, from the user interface to what the algorithm selects for to what's been valued. And that needs to be the discussion. That's always been a hard discussion in journalism. What goes on the front page or not has been a very difficult discussion. We need to have the same discussion about what engagement means, what algorithms should do, what they shouldn't do, why hearts versus stars, all of those things. We shouldn't just shut it off with, oh, we're just trying to be popular, or we're just seeking engagement. And I think we can't solve what they should do right now, but the first big thing on my wish list is for them to come clean and say, yes, we're helping shape this experience. We have a lot of power over this experience. We don't have all the answers, but let's try to think through what's the ethics, what's the potential space, what's the financing models, and then have that conversation.
Yeah, Kate, they are their algorithms, but can journalists, academics, research, or anything like that? Behind every algorithm are people, right?
That's right.
Who's writing that algorithm? Is there anything that we, all of us, journalists, media people, academics, can do to make those algorithms better?
Absolutely.
And better, of course, is judgment.
Oh, absolutely. That's a set of values too, right?
We think we know what's better. We're journalists, right? So is that a good thing to introduce into algorithms?
Well, I think this is fascinating because we tend to sort of say the word algorithms like it has this kind of spooky undercurrent that it's also the thing that platforms do, that they're using algorithms. But the traditional press, as we heard today, are very much using these kinds of capacities to, in many ways, autonomously decide how news should travel and what people should be seeing. So that move towards the autonomous news space is actually getting really fascinating because of the fact that it is people behind these algorithms. We have a moment to be thinking about, how do we teach journalism? How do we teach computer science? Are we seeing convergences in really interesting ways? And again, here I point to people like Mark at the Brown Institute, thinking about the ways in which computer science and journalism can be brought together. I do genuinely believe there's a big pedagogical responsibility right now when we teach people how you code, how you design apps, to think about the values that we're building into these systems. Every time you build a system, you are doing that with a set of values consciously or unconsciously in mind. So bringing those things to the surface, making those ethical conversations public, I think is a really important thing to do. I think another little quick thing though is newspapers had a way of hearing from their audiences in a direct way. You'd have letters to the editor. You could pick up the letter to the editor page and people would say, I have opinions about this story or this particular angle that the paper is taking. It's sometimes very difficult to feel that you have a voice with a platform. So when we saw the Hearts roll out, a lot of people are like, I really don't want this, but it's not my space. It's a privately owned company. What can I do? So that idea of how do you have a voice in these spaces, I think, remains an unanswered question.
Yeah, interesting. Andrew, algorithms.
So let's try to be clear. I don't know what Facebook tells audiences like this, but at least I feel like in the business world, it's very clear that the purpose of the Facebook newsfeed algorithm is to maximize the enterprise value of Facebook, period. Now, it's often the case that giving people what they want is going to maximize the enterprise value of Facebook, but often not, right? So if Facebook has a new Photos product and they're now hosting photos or hosting videos, they will increase the number of videos to the point that maximizes the enterprise value of Facebook. So it is not as simple as saying, like, we just respond to what users want and give them that, because that's not true. That's just clearly not what they do. They don't tell advertisers that's what they do. They don't tell news organizations that's what they do. And so it's just a slightly different angle on that. They're not doing what the content producers want, which is to get their stories in front of the maximum number of people. All right, and so here I think it's very useful to think in broad terms about 3 different approaches to this one particular problem, which is, again, out of the vast ocean, how do you present a glass of drinking water, right? There's so many tweets, blog posts, stories, status updates. You got to show people just a small number of those things. So going back in history, kind of the first algorithm that really mattered was the Google search algorithm, right? And so this is using the link structure of the internet to weight every web page according to a given search, correlated to a given search term, and then rank it. So there was ranking on a page of search results, and there's a piece of math that does that, and fundamentally it was the link structure of the internet as an expression of points of view from millions and millions of people creating web pages. So then the second one, and the one which is dominant to our discussion right now, is the Facebook newsfeed algorithm. And so here, Facebook is fundamentally a social network, right? It is a graph that connects people up. And if you notice, as you are composing a status update on Facebook, it will autocomplete people, but it will not autocomplete posts. It will not autocomplete to content. There's no way to link easily from status update to status update within Facebook. They're trying to get you to keep branching out and deepening your social graph, because that's fundamentally what the enterprise value of Facebook rests on. Twitter, by contrast, this is the third one that I think is worth taking a look at. Its default newsfeed presentation is reverse chron, right? So everybody you follow, you see everything they write in reverse chronological order. And they've attempted to try to give a little bit more structure so you can see replies in a kind of a threaded way. But fundamentally, it is reverse chron. Now, the struggle for Twitter is that they have no ability right now to turn that relentless reverse chronological like scroll into something better and more meaningful. And there are lots of people that have tried various and sundry products. I've built a couple of them that are trying to make some value out of distilling that feed. But it is the blunt force feed that I think makes Twitter so appealing to news organizations. Nobody is limiting the spread of your tweets. It's only controlled by the people who that you follow. And so Twitter is happy to have you defriend people. They make it easy to follow and unfollow. If you see something you don't like, then you unfollow that person, maybe you won't see it again. Facebook makes it very difficult to unfollow people. They really don't want you to start, snipping down your social graph. And so for Twitter, the focus on content means that they make it easy to link out. You follow and unfollow as a way of curating and controlling your own feed. And for people that are used to the open-ended world of journalism, that's a much better thing. But so anyway, when I think about the responsibility for the algorithms, I love social pressure as a control mechanism. I don't like law as a constraint here. I don't like, because it's so easy to abuse and distort and so forth, I don't like, moves to treat these algorithms as public utilities. What a fruitless exercise that would be. But you do see it crop up, especially in Europe. They're so important that we have to control it somehow and have it respond that way. I don't like particularly relying on kind of like enlightenment on the part of these platforms. Like, we should assume that they will constantly be trying to maximize the enterprise value of their firms and their stock options and everything else that motivates their employees. What I do like, though, is trying to exploit the weaknesses of those business models in order to create new things that are more responsive to the needs of journalism. That
Yeah.
personally is what I think is where the future
So
lies.
in some ways, what we're all saying here is that we built those algorithms, right? Because they're based on our preferences and our friends and that. Not completely, but there is a certain amount of responsibility on us.
In the case of Facebook, I think that I wouldn't say it that way. I think the Facebook algorithm is very consciously designed in a way that has very significant negative externalities to select the things that are most important for Facebook for you to see. That is
Yeah.
not user designed.
Yeah,
or
no,
user
interesting. Well, so that transitions into another area that I think is really interesting. It's really two combined things. And the question is really whether surveillance is the default setting of the internet, or certainly the web and social web. But to start that, though, it is about the information that we give. We are giving them, the social platforms, all of this information about ourselves. How concerned should we be, not just us, but journalists and people who are trying to, use these social platforms to communicate? How concerned should we be about how much information we're giving them? And then, of course, whether they want to or not, in many cases, the information that they have to give to others. And we've had a lot of examples of that recently. So again, what are the concerns and who's responsible there?
So I'm going to start by channeling Ethan, who couldn't be here,
Yeah.
because he wrote this great article on Internet's original sin. So you might know this or not. When in the early days of the Internet, Ethan Zuckerman was working at Tripod, which is one of the earliest user-generated content sites, and they were trying to find a financing model, and they thought of everything apparently, including micropayment versions and charging. And then he found out that people in Thailand were using the site to circulate dissident material, which to him made it really important that the site be freed. So he helped invent the pop-up ad. And to atone for that, he then went to co-found Global Voices. I don't think he's done paying for that.
All is forgiven.
Right, not yet. Because the ad financing model, as he points out in that article, which is really true, means two things. And I wrote about this too. Facebook apparently makes about $8 to $10 per user in the United States per year. And Facebook ads are the most valuable ones out there. That's peanuts, to be honest. I mean, yes, it has a lot of money in revenue because of scale, but internet ads aren't worth a lot unless there's a huge amount of surveillance built in. A lot of people are blocking ads because they're basically malware disguised as adware. You can't tell the difference. It's an awful surveillance model that's baked into the core of how these things are financed. And also going with this business model is the low employee overhead. Right? So Facebook, which has 1.5 billion customers, no, they're not customers, 1.5 billion eyeballs to sell to their customers, advertisers, to be more precise, employs very few people for moderation. It employs a lot of people, but a lot of this is done through community policing, which means, once again, politically sensitive content constantly gets flagged by political opponents if it goes near any of these very vague guidelines. So in Facebook, once again, because of a business decision to do this through ads, we are seeing around the world anything politically sensitive, especially dissident, gets taken down through community policing because Facebook is relying on a mix of algorithms and people reporting instead of employing lots of people. So I'm going back to how the maximizing enterprise value and other values are conflicting. So there's a panel later on different models of financing. I think that has to be a key discussion. I'm not naive. I realize why ad financing is attractive and there and how hard it would be to shift to other things. But I think without exploring that part of this debate, we're just going to end up holding these panels again and again where we hope Facebook listens to us like a benevolent dictator of sorts, and then they go to their, stock option people and then they say nothing about all of this. So.
Okay, so
Yeah.
surveillance as well, specifically,
Yeah, look,
not just what the platforms do, but what others are doing in terms of monitoring.
And doing to the platforms. I mean, so there's a really, I think, important debate happening right now about surveillance and platforms. And it's interesting because to some degree, there's been this sort of counter-argument that says, well, you're giving all this information to the platform, so you can't complain that you're now in this sort of very surveillance structure. But there are two things at work there that I think are worth noting. The first is that platforms are designed to seduce you into giving up ever more content about yourself all the time. And some of the time you're giving up content you're not even aware about yourself. I mean, you don't even know that you're giving away very precise details about your location when you're doing things like uploading photographs to Twitter. I mean, there are so many points in which information leakage is happening that users are not aware of, and let's face it, platforms really don't necessarily want you to be aware of just how much information you're sharing all the time. They just want you to do more of it. And there are a lot of good business reasons why they do that. But what we've seen now is that Facebook made a statement earlier this morning I think it was actually specifically about government requests for information. They're getting ever more requests for user information from GCHQ and the NSA. This is a very difficult moment for the platforms thinking about their relationships to governments. But it also means that I think users have to realize that these platforms are extremely focused spaces of surveillance. There's an enormous amount of attention from the intelligence agencies and from policing organizations to what happens in those spaces. But quite outside of just the kind of state surveillance, there are other forms of surveillance that I think are sort of more nefarious and harder to spot. And this is where we get to issues around data discrimination. So there was that amazing study that the University of Cambridge put out a couple of years ago showing that just by looking at someone's Facebook likes, you could figure out their political preferences, you could figure out their sexual preferences, you could figure out whether they're an alcohol or drug user. Now, that information is something that you could use to make a decision about whether somebody gets housing, whether somebody gets insurance, whether somebody gets a job. Trying to think about those points where information is being used against people is actually extremely difficult right now because those channels are so opaque. So one of the things that I think is really important in this space when we talk about surveillance is not just thinking about it from the state surveillance aspect, which is incredibly important, but to add to it that these kind of surveillance platforms are being used now to have enormous impacts in people's lives. So where's due process in that system? Where do you get to understand where information is being used against you in specific ways? We don't have those kinds of due process systems yet. I think we urgently need them.
And Andrew, on that same subject, but also sort of going into that area of government responsibility, you've worked in both areas. What are the concerns about surveillance, censorship in some cases?
Yeah, well, let's talk about the.
But also, it can't all be the platform's responsibilities. Policy and other things.
So first of all, let's talk about I think the sharpest way to grasp what's at stake is think about the case of a national security reporter who reports, let's say, some kind of dramatic story about misconduct on the part of the intelligence agencies, and the agencies go after that reporter to identify sources. Now, traditionally, where no platform dependency exists, the publisher can make a decision to challenge it in court and essentially engage in civil disobedience to protect those sources. Katharine Graham can just run the newspaper, protect the journalism, and make that decision. They can choose whether or not to give up that information. If that communication came in through Facebook Messenger or Gmail, then a third party is introduced into the equation. And in this country, with however flawed it is, our broad system of rule of law, you could go into court and ask for an order directing the third-party platform not to turn that data over, to respect a constitutional privilege against the disclosure of sources, if it exists. But that introduction of the third party makes things complicated. Now, when a publisher is putting all of their content out, and a dissident is putting all of their political speech out onto a platform, then that platform essentially gets to make decisions about when to turn over data and when not. So the thing to me that is sort of the most interesting is that the platform companies make decisions about which country's jurisdiction to respect, which country's requests to comply with, on the basis of typically very pragmatic questions. Do you have any employees in that country? Do you have any revenue that can be seized in that country? Do you care? So when I was at Google, this is one of the things I ran for the company, was the process of running these risk calculations and trying to figure it out. And the good news there was, at least those founders took it seriously. They actually cared a lot. It helped that Sergey was a refugee from the Soviet Union, and really took seriously that question. But there were, even there, these massive competing pressures. The ad salespeople want to have people on the ground in Turkey, want to have people on the ground in Thailand, want to have the people on the ground in Singapore. And then when those governments turn over requests for information, actually a great, an even better country is India. Massive market, largely a democracy, pretty weak rule of law. And so, a police chief there would use the law, make a demand on Google for what are blatantly politicized, rather than kind of legitimate law enforcement reasons. And then Google, with its 3,000 employees on the ground there, has to make a decision about, like, do you want, the head of your company to be jailed or not? And so one of the things that you have to pay attention to, and, a good resource for this is the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which kind of judges companies on their law enforcement compliance policies. And we should also mention Rebecca McKinnon's new effort to try to use naming and shaming to nudge companies to do the right thing. But when a company makes a decision to be physically present and to have employees, it radically changes its relationship to law enforcement. At Google, we just blew off any request from any country that didn't have literally hostages that could be taken. And any country that did, then we had to take seriously and figure out whether to comply with that request. So anyway, it's just another area. And I'll say, just as a form of marketing, one of the nonprofits that I'm active with is called Access Now, runs a help desk service with people in Tunis, Manila, and Costa Rica, specifically to help journalists and activists understand how to, for example, capture a video in, let's say, northern Syria and get it out of the country without betraying their identity to people that could come and kill them or arrest them or whatever.
But this gets more complicated.
Project lives alongside the need for these people to be conscious of what's happening on the platforms.
So sorry to join in. I just wanted to ask you, though, because it seems to me that there's something a little bit more complicated if those investigative journalists are actually investigating technology companies. So what if you're actually doing a big investigation into Google and Google can just basically read your email and see what you're doing? Now, this might sound funny, but guess what? It just happened a month ago when an Australian journalist was writing a very critical story looking at the business practices of Vodafone. And then what Vodafone did, we now have evidence of this, went through all of her call records, she happened to be a Vodafone subscriber, to see who her potential source was within the company so that they could track down that source and fire them. So all I'm saying is, the surveillance is not just against states.
No.
Sometimes these companies are actually the companies that need to be investigated as well. So for journalists, thinking about InfoSec and privacy and how your information travels is actually really important.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, anybody, though, who's investigating Vodafone and using a Vodafone phone, seriously, that's just like dopey. Like, it'd be nice.
I think that's really not.
But it'd be nice if we
That's
looked
not
at.
fair.
Yeah.
Exactly. What about Facebook?
So, for example, I
Shouldn't
write,
use
I-
Facebook to send.
No, not that. I write for the New York Times every month, and some of my op-eds have criticized Facebook. Now, I don't think they're going to retaliate against the New York Times because of me, but what if I was a smaller outfit, not the New York Times, and without Facebook, you are dead in the water, in the world out there. You cannot, if you're not spreading through Facebook, you're not going to make it in the journalism world. And what if it wasn't the New York Times that I wrote critical op-eds for?
Exactly. And I feel like we shouldn't blame journalists here. I mean, I think in some ways, when we think about platform responsibilities, we also have responsibilities to the way that platforms engage with journalists.
Well, for sure.
On
I'm taking
that
an even
subject,
darker view, though, which is like, in no way should you trust these No, you shouldn't trust these platforms to somehow maintain what I believe to be a genuinely, pretty widely diffused sense of ethical responsibility that would cause them to not do that. But you shouldn't trust,
You shouldn't trust anyone. But on
Yeah.
that subject, I mean, just to go into the next, that next area, then we have seen a lot of revolving door. I mean, some of us are examples of people who've been on one side or another of this equation, if it even exists anymore. Platforms, governments, journalists, who everybody's moving now. It seems that platforms have journalists working for them in some form or another, either in PR or curating in other ways. And that is a potentially a concern. I'd like to hear, whether that is a concern. But also, just to try to maybe lighten it a little bit, is there a way in which we can improve the way in which everybody talks to each other? Is there a way in which the door, it's great, the platforms are here, we're here, that we've been talking about doing this for years, Emily and Claire and others, we're all here. Is there a better way to sort of continue that conversation and keep those doors open? But also, revolving doors can make it confusing.
Right, so there's a great responsibility. I think we're all agreed that they hold a lot of power, and no matter how cynical or optimist you might be about what they're doing. I actually think this is a great time to be talking to them because the companies are still young and they're run by, there's strong founder effects. As you know, Sergey's, parents being refugees has had an effect. Believe it or not, as someone who's very critical of them, people don't believe me when I say this. I get very routine conversations with these platforms on what the right thing is on a particular subject. Sometimes it's public, sometimes it's behind the scenes, and I think a lot of people get this. I don't think this is going to be true forever. I don't think, as one Facebook employee says, in Facebook, Slack is like the Supreme Court. You can always appeal to someone and say this is the wrong thing, and there's a shot that it may or may not work, and in some cases I've seen it work. These companies are going to become even more of what you just said, which is they're going to be maximize enterprise 100%, the founders are going to sell, Wall Street is going to be a lot more dominant. So we're not even going to have the conversations we're having now. This is what I say whenever I talk to these people is, you're setting some standards that will, like we criticize you, they won't even be there in 10 years if we don't do something really strong to set, just the way journalism has certain internal standards that makes it difficult for, if an advertiser came to the New York Times and said, kill the story, there would be, just journalistically, they wouldn't do that. There'd be an institutional ethics against that. I think these platforms have to think, the criticisms right now, they have to think about how do we institutionalize these so that our rights and responsibilities are more explicit, more direct conversations, because in 20 years, I don't think we'll have any influence like this. And whatever they're setting up now and whatever we set up now, I think it's going to get worse from here on, is what I think.
So
There's the happy note for the day.
Is the conversation happening? Are we just shouting at each other, or is there a conversation happening?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think there's a really fascinating conversation right now, and I think the layer where I see this happening best is the engineering layer. So we've seen some fantastic software engineers move between traditional news companies into startups and then back, and I'm really excited to see how that's been happening at places like the New York Times, when just extraordinary people there doing wonderful things who then go and set up their own startups. So at that engineering layer, I see an extraordinary amount of knowledge and debate and contention around these ideas. So that's where I see the most hope.
Yep.
But given this is also the panel on ethics, the other thing that really excites me that I see as a kind of like, this is the way forward. I'm sure many of you saw that this week, the White House's Chief Technology Officer, DJ Patel, made a really strong call saying that every single computer science and data science program needs to be teaching data ethics. That is a huge stamp of approval saying this is where we need to do the most work. And I think that is where we need to do the most work, and that's a space which is inherently interdisciplinary. That's where people from journalism schools, people from social science, people from computer science can all get together and have these conversations around what values are most important to us. So for me, that's where the most exciting conversation is right now, and where the most work is to be done.
Yeah. And maybe the platforms can pay for some of that too, so that would complete the circle. But Andrew, your thoughts on sort of the conversation, can we get past the concerns and the shouting and which are all very worth shouting about, and have a meaningful conversation between publishers and platforms that will help?
Yeah, I don't think that's missing, honestly.
Yeah.
Like, as far as I can tell, there are like completely open and good-hearted people at all of these companies, at all of these publishers, actively trying to figure this out. What I will say is, though, that I very much think that the idea that there is going to emerge a kind of like a new stability to replace, the old like kind of geographical monopoly newspaper that advertisers have to go to and that pays for the creation of great journalism, and that there is going to be no more stable resting place. And so, is there going to be a stable duopoly of iOS and Android and mobile? No. is there going to be a stable, like Facebook is your social network, Twitter is, no, it's like none of those things are going to be stable. And so the real trick, I think, for these conversations is for publishers not to kind of like desperately seek, little protected zones within these technology platforms, but rather to reconfigure themselves as builders and build stuff that is capable of keeping up with the demands of the marketplace and the technology landscape that surrounds us. And so that to me is sort of like the fundamental thing that I want to see out of the New York Times and out of the Washington Post and out of the All and everybody in between is an effort to try to build better stuff that won't simply kind of like grasp at the crumbs of revenue that fall out of these platforms. Yeah. That is really the future solution, is to build better stuff.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and to wrap up, and I want one final thing from each one of you, is that I firmly believe that while journalism is the enemy of scale, that a lot of these platforms are actually realizing that scale isn't the answer to everything, and that quality actually can sell at a premium, and that things like filtering and curation and journalism can actually help them make more money. And I think that's a really key point that we can all take advantage of, because that's something that we can all be interested in. But just to wrap up very quickly, if anyone has one quick question, we can probably take it, but just to very quickly from each of you, on the research side, what is something that this community, academic community particularly, one quick thing that we can do and research that will help us answer some of these questions?
Okay. So a lot of what Kate said, that's obviously one big area. The thing that I don't see happening as much as the platforms and algorithms are moving to machine learning, and the surveillance is moving to computational inference. The study she mentions, it's inferring things you have not disclosed. Right? That's the key. The surveillance can tell whether you're gay or you're a drug user, even if you've not disclosed it to a single person online. So not using Vodafone doesn't save you either. And machine learning systems that are really coming, I guess, of age, they're opaque to their programmers too, because that's the point of them. Too complex to summarize here. And they have major effects. So we're moving very rapidly into systems that figure out things you have not disclosed, and algorithms that do things that you didn't directly program into them. I would like both of those to be researched in combinations of people who ask what could go wrong, along with people who are technical, who are like, let's go and see if that could go wrong. Because right now, all I'm hearing is, oh, look, it works, rather than what could go wrong. Yeah. Long list.
Very quick on research.
I'd second what Zainab said about machine learning. One of the really interesting groups I've been working with recently is people in machine learning and information retrieval thinking about the ethics of ML. Yep. Really tough space. But the other thing I'd say is experimentation. What happens when we see, we're used to sort of seeing a set of news stories that effectively a group of senior editors have decided to show us every day. But what happens when we have a set of autonomous and semi-autonomous algorithms basically running experiments on you all the time to decide what kinds of news you'll click on more, what kinds of ads are going to attract you more? How does that kind of constant experimentation change the idea of the news sphere? That's something that we don't really have a lot of data around, and certainly the Facebook emotional contagion experiment was an indication of just how much of this is going on and just how little we have by way of a public discourse around what it means.
Yeah, fascinating.
Well, this may sound kind of basic, but reverse engineering the content selection algorithms is something which the research community alone can do. Yeah. The companies, for very good reason, will not disclose those for perfectly good competitive reasons. Very often, people inside the companies don't actually know what or how the algorithms are working, and so to make judgments about ethics and so forth, we have to have some picture of reality. And I think the research community alone is in a position to cast light on that.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. I'm getting wrapped up, but one quick question since you did
Thank you, and this is very related to what you guys were just saying, which is, as a data scientist and machine learner myself, who thinks about this kind of thing, it's obviously not enough to ask for data scientists to take ethics courses if they, number one, don't understand the machine learning algorithms that they program and don't understand why they work, aren't given enough time to think about what could go wrong, and B, if they're actually just doing what their boss tells them to do. Yeah. And ultimately, I feel like What we're really talking about is like rules, or almost kind of like laws, being obscured in code, and then that code
There's
is
an
under the
awful lot-
power of
an
the
awful
people
lot
in
going
charge.
into those algorithms and those codes. There's no doubt about it at all. I have to wrap up. We've been given the final word. Thank you so much, all three of you, and Ethan for contributing remotely, and thank you, Claire.